Hi everyone, Ghoster here, and today instead of making a full 3D tutorial like usual, I decided to go through a few tips and tricks on how to make sure your models are ready to be integrated inside a game engine specifically for VR. Now this video is not necessarily for 3D artists. The stuff I'm going to be covering here are actually aimed for indie devs or Unity hardcore developers or Unreal who don't necessarily know or have 3D experience. The three main points I'm going to be discussing today are: one, scale. Scale is very important, and I'm going to show you how to adjust scale to make sure it's a one-to-one scale so that when you import it inside a game engine, you don't have to scale it up and down, and you will find it ready to go with the real-world scale. The second is the pivot points. I'm going to be showing you how to adjust the pivot points in the different 3D models and make sure they're suitable for your needs. Having the right pivot point could save you a lot of time in terms of placing the objects around the game engine or using them even in scripting. The third, and it's the least general tip because it's a case by case, but I'm going to be looking at lightmaps, a very minor fix that may save you time when implementing assets inside a game engine. So let's get started. First, I have this scene here in Blender open, and if this is your first time in Blender, just go to File, User Preferences. I always like to show people this is having to go to Input, then select with, and make sure it says left instead of right, because for some reason Blender has the default selection button to be the right mouse button, which is kind of counterintuitive for most of us. Unless you're a lefty and you use your left hand with the mouse, then you're good to go. With that out of the way, I'm seeing a scene with assets. There is the shield, the ball, and the bow, and other assets from the from the streams we've used before, and they're all out of scale. They're like way out of scale. And I'm using this little fella right here. It's a stick figure, like a wooden stick figure, which is set in the right scale. And if you want to download this, it's on BlendSwap for free. It's a community for free assets. I'm going to put the link down below. So this little fellow right here has the height of 1.88 meters, which is above average height, but still you could scale anything, any objects, meshes to this scale. Now the rest are obviously way out of scale. And first, to start scaling these objects, I'm going to be taking one at a time. If I hold the shift and select this guy as well, and then shift hide to hide anything else, and then just select the object, make sure it's in object mode, and then hit S and start scaling down. You can keep an eye on the measurements on the right, dimensions of the bow, and it's rotated to the side. Let me just hit Alt R. That's gonna reset the rotation. Make sure it's on one axis. I'm going to rotate it again to the other axis, move it around. So obviously it's still big, but I'm going to move it closer to the guy just to have a frame of reference on how far I should be scaling this bow. And I'm going to keep scaling this down, way down, about let's see, maybe here. I'm keeping an eye on the Y. In this case it's 80 centimeters, which is above average height for this bow. So we have this scaled. Well, great. We have this in scale. Now when we import it inside Unity or any game engine, it's going to show up in the right scale. However, we're not done yet. Let's hit Control A, and then just this menu is going to pop up. Hit Scale. That means it's going to apply scale. And watch before I do this. If you go look here in the scale menu, it says 0.024, which is the amount of scale we applied to this bow to make it this small. Now this is no good. The scale hasn't been applied to the mesh. Actually, it's just showing that it's small. But if you go ahead and export, it's most likely gonna scale up to 111, and it's not gonna show up the right scale in the game engine. So make sure you hit Control A and then hit Scale again. which means the scale is going to go back to 111. The scale values we have applied for before have been applied to this mesh, and now it's ready to be exported. Now I'm not going to export this right now. I'm going to show you how to do it on other meshes as well. Same thing, hit Alt-R to like reset the rotation and hit scale again. Keep scaling. There you go. I think this looks good for this. Just hit Control A again and scale. Perfect. Now we've covered the scale point. And before we move on to the next point, I'm just gonna select all three of these objects and go File, Export, and then FBX. And then I'm gonna just export that to the desktop and call it, I don't know, objects. And then just make sure it says selected objects only, checked, so that it only exports the objects we selected. And you can select the form, the type of the objects. There is mesh, armature. If you have any objects that is rigged, make sure you select that by holding Shift. It's gonna output the armature in the mesh as well. Now, if you're exporting for game engines, obviously you don't need lamps or cameras or any of the other types of objects, just the mesh and armature. I'm gonna hit Export, and let's go to Unity. I have it open right here. Yep, it's objects.fbx. Let's import that in. Gonna take a moment to load. Let me load these to the scene right away and see what we have to work with. Oh, great. This is so we don't have that problem. The major problem when scaling objects inside Unity was that if you import the object right away inside Unity and it's not in real world scale, you have to scale down individually the objects using this scale meter. And you don't want to do that necessarily. Maybe for your scripts are all done inside Unity, assuming the mesh original scale is 111 instead of some random value you have to input and try out. And that's mainly the issue we try to solve here. As you can see, it's not exactly solved. It says scale 100, 100, 100. Now, why is that? I want the scale to be saying 111 instead of 100, 100, 100. That's mainly due to Blender exporting FBX. Sometimes it messes up the Unity or the unit conversion between centimeters and meters. So if I go back to export again and export to FBX, and there is this neat little button that's around scale right over here. Now you could set the scale to 0.01 and that should solve the problem. But the best one is to check this button. You see that it was dark gray, now it's normal gray, and it means the problem should be fixed. I'm gonna hit Export FBX again. Let me delete this objects which we have right now. Delete from the scene. Let me re-import this FBX again. Give it a moment to load. If we load it back to the scene and select individual meshes, you can see the scale is set to 111, which is exactly what we want. Perfect. And that's how you kind of correct the scale for any mesh that you end up downloading from somewhere. And the assets I provided for the streams, some of them have this issue, so this is how you can correct it. The second point which we want to cover is the pivot points. Now, pivot points, like I said, for example, in this chair, it's set up correctly. Actually, no, it's not. It's set up the wrong way. You see this blue dot over here where the gizmo is located? That's the pivot point. Now, if I want to rotate the chair or whatever, it's not doing it right. Obviously, I want the pivot point to be at the base, for example, of the chair, or maybe at the top. Most of the time in furniture, you want the pivot point to be at the base, so that when you type in Z equal to 0, or Y inside Unity, let me check. Yeah, it's the Z axis. If you want to make sure your object is resting on the ground, obviously you would want to make the position along the z-axis to be set to 0. That can only happen if you have the pivot point set up in the right location. So if I hit tab inside Blender, it's going to go to edit mode. You can also select this like object mode and edit mode. You want to go to edit mode and hit A to deselect any of the selected. So A to select everything, A to deselect everything. Go to points mode, and you can be clever about this. It's up to you. So there is a way for you to set up the pivot point here, right here at the base. You can do it in multiple ways. For you to do that, you can either follow the pivot point, which is like the hardest way to do it. Select everything and then just hit G to start moving the object around, or like the points, the individual points. We are in edit mode. We're now editing points, and then just move the object all the way to the pivot point. And now you can see that the pivot point is sitting exactly at the base. So if we exit the edit mode by going to object mode or hitting tab, you can see the pivot point is exactly what we wanted. But in this case, we moved the points to the pivot point. That's not always practical. So I'm going to undo that. Let's go back and do this again. If you can click the right mouse button in Blender anywhere, let me exit the object mode. You can see this little circle, kind of like a crosshair, showing up each time you click the right mouse button. That's called the 3D cursor. And if you scroll down this right menu, which you can get by the N key, I didn't mention this before, this right panel can be shown by the N key on your keyboard. So if you scroll down, this 3D cursor location is what affects this cursor. So if we go and say, for example, I want this to sit flat on the ground, you can see this little circle over here jumped. Blender allows you to place this wherever you like, not just by the mouse, but also automatically. So if I want to say, I want the pivot point to sit right in the middle of this sphere, or sorry, cylinder. So I want it to be at the center, but I want it obviously to be z equal to 0. So I want it to be all the way down to the bottom. The way you can do that is make sure you're in the vertices or edges mode by selecting each one here, and hold Alt and click in the right here. You can see that there are two vertices. I'm clicking on the edge between them while holding Alt. That means Blender is gonna just understand that I want to make a loop selection, and so after the loop selection is made, I can see that the gizmo is sitting right at the center. That basically allows me to manipulate these points, but we don't want them to do that. What I want to do is hit Shift S and then say cursor to selected. This is like a snap menu. There is an option that says cursor to selected, and you can see when I do that, the 3D cursor, which we have seen before, jumped right to the middle of this cylinder over here. Now the next thing I want to do is just go to 3D cursor, go to the Z axis and just type in 0, and you can see that the 3D cursor is at the base of this chair. The next thing you want to do is, after you exit the edit mode, go back to object mode, and this is like a hand-braking shortcut. I don't know why they do it in Blender. It's Control Shift Alt and C, and it's gonna give you this menu that says Set Origin, which means the pivot point, Origin to Geometry. That could work. Sometimes Origin to Geometry works, not in this specific case. You can see the pivot point is now jumped to that area. We still want it to come back to the base where the 3D cursor is. So do it again, Control Shift Alt and C, and then say Origin to 3D cursor. And there you have it. Now the pivot point for this chair is exactly where we want it. If you want to place this inside Unity, you can drag it to the area and just type in Z equal to 0 to make sure it's sitting on the ground flat. Same thing here for this bowling pin. It's out of scale, obviously, but it's like the pivot point is the other way around. We want the pivot point to sit at the base. So if we jump to the edit mode, select these, or you can actually just select this point. So select these and then just Shift S to cursor to select it, exit the edit mode, go back to object mode, and then just Control Alt Shift C and origin to 3D cursor. And now we have the pivot point the right place we want it to be. We can then start scaling in regards to this little fella over here. Delete that. You can keep doing this, like scaling, adjusting the pivot point, and scaling in regards to this guy over here to make sure all of your objects are in scale. And again, do the export like mentioned before. The last point I want to be covering is the UV maps, or more specifically, the light maps. Now, say for example you imported this model by going to File, Import FBX, and you just locate your model, which is this one. I'm setting up the box. I want to export this first. Like, let me export it again. FBX. Make sure this one is unchecked so that it's 1:1 scale. I'm gonna export that FBX over there. Let me delete these for now. It's the box. Import that in. Now, I'm gonna mark this as static, and I'm gonna bake the lighting on it and see what we have. The results. Let's go to lighting and adjust some settings and hit build. And that looks horrible. What's happening in here? The light baking came out completely horrible. You can play around with all the settings as you want, but it's not gonna fix anything. If you take a look at the light map, you can open it up, and it's gonna open in Photoshop, and you can see it's not showing up as you would expect. So the faces are not, they look like they're all piling up on the same space. And if you go back to Blender, slide this, click left and hold, like and drag, you can open a new viewport, go back to UV mapping, or like right button at this button at the bottom, hit UV image editor, and it's going to open the UV editor for this object. Now the way to access UV editing is just hit edit mode, or by hitting tab, or just selecting edit mode over here. And if you hit A to select all faces, it's going to show you all the faces, but I'm only seeing one. What's happening? Well, the reason for that is because all of the faces are actually on top of each other. If I try to drag them, you can see they're actually on top of each other and linked in a very weird way, honestly. Gonna undo that. And also the other problem I'm seeing is that it has only one UV map set for it. Usually you'd have to go with two UV maps, one for texturing and the other for light maps. So the 3D artists usually do this a lot. This is what I'm seeing here as like all the faces piled up on top of each other. That's not a problem, that's not a bug or anything. The 3D artist, me in this case, did this intentionally to save texture space. I want the logo to be, or whatever art, the texture in this case, to be as high res as possible. And I didn't want to like break down the cube UV map all the way smaller, and then you would have to scale down the textures. It's not going to look very neat. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna let me clear the sims for this and try to do, this is the proper way to UV map a cube. Let's see, mark sims and then just hit unwrap again. This is the way you would normally unwrap a cube. The specific or the different faces are all separated from each other in a way so that they're not interlacing. However, in texturing, you don't always want to do that. Most of the cases, 3D artists wanted to save texture space, so they will always end up, most of the time, piling up the same or similar faces that share the same texture. They will pile them all on top of each other, like this cube had before. So what I'm going to do is actually undo the UV mapping for this one. Let's keep this UV map as it is. I'm going to hit the plus button, which is what you want to do. Create another map. Now, to quickly view this, you go to the second UV map, and it's identical to the first one because it's a duplicate. What you want to do is, there is a quick way to do this. Just hit, actually a few ways to do this. We can do this in the UV editor by hitting Control P. Let's go back again. So hitting Control P is going to separate the faces and lay them out next to each other. That's great. What you want to do, be careful with hitting the Control P shortcut, is just going to be editing the margin over here. When Unity or any of the game engines bake maps, they need some space between the faces. You want to introduce some space between the faces so that there is some bleed on the edges. And Unity does that, and there is a setting for you to set up the bleed for UV maps or lighting inside Unity. I'm sure you've seen that setting. So you want to adjust the margin to a specific point, say for example this much. And if we go back to the UV map, the previous UV map, you can see the faces are still piled up on top of each other, but the second UV map, we have the faces separated. Now let's go back and export this file, export FBX and box, and then just re-import this box over here. Just delete all of these. Let's go ahead in the box, import that in. Neat. Now let's make sure it says static and build. Looking much better. If you can look at this, the light map over here, it's clearly doing what we want. It separated the faces. There is some weird shading problem going on, but that's not directly related to our UV maps. What you can do is also do the other, like UV mapping of the normal cube, and that's going to look a lot better. Let me do that quickly. Mark same, and then just UV unwrap that. The other thing you want to be careful about using in the UV maps, so say for example in this UV map, I can drag the faces to outside the 0 to 1 space, and that's going to be fine. Why? Because the UVs and the textures are they tile basically. So there's some let me just do unwrap and light map. Okay. The main idea I'm trying to show here is that the UV textures keep tiling on top of each other. Just because the texture is showing up in this area doesn't mean it doesn't exist outside. It actually keeps tiling further and further and further. So if I move any of the faces, say for example this face, if I move it down, you can see that it's actually virtually moving on the screen, almost as if I'm taking it from the top and bringing it here. So the idea is that for texturing, you can actually keep the individual UV islands outside of the 0 to 1 space, and some artists do that. Sometimes they want to scale or like get most of the UV maps, so they probably will end up doing the UV islands a little bit outside the 0 to 1 space. That happens. However, you cannot do that for the light maps. You have to keep the light maps inside the 0 to 1 space, and there should be no interlacing faces. Let me export that again. FBX box. Great. Try to import that. I know you could just replace it in the file or the folder structure inside Unity. I'm just lazy to bring that out. Static. And let's go to lighting and build. So it's very similar to the last result, except for the weird shading. which is not related to the UVs. Now this is perfect. Yeah. So you basically have one way to do it. You either take whatever there is in the actual UV map, duplicate it, and hit Control P, and that's just gonna rearrange all the islands. Say for example, I want to take this off. Hit Control P. That's gonna rearrange all the islands inside the 0 to 1 space with the proper separation between them. Or you can do the UV seams basically, which is a little bit harder to do. I can do a tutorial about that. UV unwrapping. I've shown a few ways to do it in previous tutorials, but I can do like a standalone UV mapping if you guys want. That's it for today. If you guys have any other tips or questions or issues you usually face with 3D models, post them in the comments below or ask the questions on our forums, and I'll try to get those as soon as I can. This been it. This is Ghoster, over and out.